Every morning, Emily was surprised to find something new on her doorstep. At first, it was just a small object, an old shoe, dirty and mismatched. She chuckled to herself, thinking maybe someone had accidentally left it behind, but when she picked it up, she noticed the faint scent of a dog. She shrugged it off as a random occurrence and tossed the shoe aside. The next morning, there was something else, a half-chewed tennis ball. Emily stood there for a moment staring at it, unsure what to make of it. She didn't own a dog, and no one in the neighborhood had a dog that she knew of. Still, she picked it up, thinking maybe it was from a nearby pet, though she found it odd that it had ended up at her door. The following day, another odd item, a torn scarf, appeared, draped over the doorstep like it was waiting for her. At first, Emily thought maybe it was just a coincidence, some random series of events. But after the third or fourth day, her curiosity grew. She started to look for patterns, wondering if the items meant something more. There was no denying it. The gifts, if that's what they were, seemed to have a purpose. They were too intentional, too regular. Emily began to wonder about the dog she was convinced was behind them. It was a stray, of course. She had seen it around the neighborhood. A scruffy dog, small but with a look of quiet intelligence in its eyes. He never approached her directly, but always stayed at a distance, watching her. She had occasionally seen the dog sniffing around the yard or trotting down the street, and she had assumed he belonged to someone nearby. But now it seemed clear. The dog had been bringing her these odd little objects. Each day, something new would appear, always on the doorstep, always left in the same spot. It was as if the dog was trying to communicate with her, but in a way that was beyond anything she had experienced with pets before. She smiled softly as she knelt to pick up another item the dog had left, a broken watch. The items were strange, but somehow it felt like the dog was offering them with a purpose. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the gifts. Every day the dog left something new on her doorstep. Old coins, a rusty key, and even a bent spoon. The objects weren't valuable, but they were always strange, often worn and weathered, as if they had been carried from somewhere far away. Emily started keeping a small collection of them on her kitchen counter. The randomness of it all intrigued her, but more than that, it felt like the dog was trying to tell her something. At first, she thought it was just his way of interacting with her, like a gesture of some sort. Maybe the dog wanted attention, or perhaps he was just looking for a bit of food or affection. But after several days of receiving these strange gifts, she felt like there was a deeper meaning. Emily began to watch for the dog, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. But he always seemed to arrive when she wasn't looking. He would leave his offerings and disappear into the neighborhood as silently as he came. The more she saw this, the more she realized that there was something purposeful about his visits. He was bringing her items, things that he had found and chosen to give her. One morning, after discovering a broken pocket watch at her doorstep, Emily decided she couldn't just keep wondering. She had to know where these things were coming from. That afternoon, she waited by the window, peering out through the blinds, hoping to see the dog approach. It wasn't long before she saw him, scruffy, with a coat of matted fur, but with the same intelligent eyes that had watched her from a distance. He was trotting down the sidewalk, his tail held low but steady. As he reached the front of her house, he stopped, looked up at the window where she was standing, and then dropped something on the ground. This time, it was a small silver ring, tarnished but clearly valuable. Emily's heart raced as the dog turned and disappeared back down the street without another glance back. She rushed outside, collecting the ring from the porch. She held it in her hand, feeling the cool metal, and she knew, without a doubt, that the dog was giving her something important, something he wanted her to understand. It was at that moment that Emily realized the gifts weren't random at all. The dog wasn't just bringing things. He was bringing pieces of something bigger, something she hadn't quite figured out yet. but she was certain it was something she had to follow. The following days felt different for Emily. With each new item left by the dog, the sense of mystery deepened. It wasn't just the oddness of the gifts anymore. It was the sense of connection she felt with him, as though he was trying to communicate in the only way he knew how. She found herself waking up early, her mind buzzing with anticipation, wondering what strange thing would appear next. Every time the dog came to her door, it felt like a puzzle piece was being placed into a larger picture. That afternoon, after discovering an old, worn-out leather wallet, Emily felt a sudden impulse. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to understand why the dog was leaving her these things. So, she decided to follow him, to see where he went and why he was choosing her to receive these peculiar gifts. She took a deep breath and walked out into the yard, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of the dog. It wasn't long before she spotted him, a little farther down the road, sniffing at the ground. She kept a distance, following quietly as he trotted along, his tail swaying gently from side to side. She tried not to get too close, not wanting to scare him away, but she was determined to uncover his secret. The dog led her through several blocks, down alleyways she'd never noticed before. She followed him patiently, always careful not to make a sound. He seemed completely unaware of her presence, focused entirely on the path ahead. Emily felt both excited and anxious. What was he going to show her? Why was he bringing her all these strange things? After several turns, the dog stopped in front of an old, abandoned house. It was nothing more than a crumbling structure with broken windows and peeling paint. The yard was overgrown, and there was no sign of life, yet the dog didn't hesitate. He stepped up onto the porch and dropped something in front of the door, a small metal box. Emily froze, her heart pounding. This was it. She had followed him here. But what now? The dog seemed to sense her presence at that moment, looking back toward her with a knowing gaze. His tail wagged just once, before he turned and walked away, leaving her standing on the doorstep, unsure of what to do next. Emily stood there, frozen on the doorstep of the abandoned house, staring at the small metal box the dog had left behind. Her heart raced as she wondered what it meant. Why had he brought her here? She looked back down the street to make sure no one was watching. The dog, having already disappeared, had left her alone with the mystery. The air was still, thick with the anticipation of what she might discover. Emily hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, her fingers trembling slightly as she crouched to pick up the box. It was small and rusted, but there was something oddly familiar about it. She carefully turned it over, inspecting every inch, but there was no visible lock or hinge, just an old worn surface that seemed to have been handled many times before. With a deep breath, Emily decided to open it. She slid her fingers along the edges, gently prying it apart. As the lid creaked open, a soft metallic clink echoed in the quiet yard. Inside, there was something wrapped in a piece of faded cloth. Emily pulled it out, unwrapping it slowly, revealing a small stack of old photographs. Her breath caught in her throat. The first photo showed a young woman smiling, standing in front of what looked like a similar abandoned house. Emily's hand shook as she flipped through the next few pictures. They were all of the same woman, along with a man, and in some of the pictures there was the dog, looking much younger but unmistakably the same. The pictures seemed old, like they had been taken decades ago. The connection was too strange to ignore. Who were these people? Why had the dog brought her these pictures? Emily's mind raced as she tried to process what she was seeing. The dog had never acted like this before. These weren't just random items, they were pieces of a past, pieces of a story she didn't understand. She wondered if the dog had been a part of their lives too. Maybe he had once belonged to the couple in the photographs. Or perhaps he was trying to reconnect Emily with something long forgotten, something hidden in time. As Emily continued to look through the photographs, A realization began to settle in. This wasn't just a stray dog leaving strange gifts. It was a dog with a mission, and she had unknowingly become part of that mission. The mystery was far deeper than she could have imagined. Emily sat on the crumbling porch of the abandoned house, the small metal box and its contents resting in her lap. Her hands shook slightly as she sifted through the photographs, each one telling a story she didn't fully understand. The faces in the pictures seemed so familiar yet so distant, as if they were from another time and place, people she'd never met but somehow felt connected to. She turned the images over in her mind, trying to piece together their meaning. But nothing made sense. Not the dog's strange gifts, not the pictures, and certainly not the old house that had somehow become the center of everything. The more Emily thought about it, the more questions swirled in her mind. Why had this dog, a stray she had only recently noticed, come to her with these items? Why now, and what did it all mean? It was as if he had chosen her for a purpose, like there was something she was meant to find or understand. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, making her feel as though she was unraveling a mystery that had been hidden for years. Her thoughts were interrupted by a rustling sound nearby. She looked up to see the dog again, standing just a few feet away, watching her intently with his soft brown eyes. It was as if he had been waiting for her to make the connection, to realize that the pieces were all there, right in front of her. Emily's heart raced as she stared at him. She wasn't sure whether to feel frightened or grateful, but somehow she felt a deep sense of trust in the dog. He had led her here, and now it was as if he was waiting for her to take the next step. Without a word, the dog turned and trotted a few steps toward the overgrown path that led deeper into the yard. Emily hesitated, but then stood, holding the photographs tightly in her hand. She didn't know where this path would lead or what she would find, but something in her told her she couldn't stop now. The dog had shown her this place for a reason, and she was determined to uncover what that reason was. As she followed him down the path, Emily's thoughts raced. There was something important waiting for her, something that tied together the dog, the photographs, and the strange sense of connection she felt to this place. She had no idea what the answer would be, but she knew she had to keep going. Emily followed the dog down the overgrown path, her steps hesitant but determined. The photographs in her hand seemed to weigh heavier with each step, their meaning slipping further from her grasp, yet becoming more urgent. The dog led her deeper into the yard, his tail swaying as he moved with purpose. Emily couldn't help but feel that there was something she was supposed to discover, something she had overlooked all this time. The house, once vibrant and full of life, stood like a skeleton, broken windows, peeling paint, and an air of abandonment that seemed to seep into her very bones. But as Emily walked closer, she realized there was more to it. The yard, though wild and untamed, had been lived in, even loved at some point. Old flower beds, now choked with weeds, still had traces of color. There was a sense of nostalgia in the air, a feeling that this place had seen better days. The dog stopped at the edge of the porch and sat down, looking back at Emily, as if telling her that she had reached the final destination. His eyes were calm but steady, and she knew instinctively that this was the moment. The photographs, the strange items, the house, it was all leading up to this. She stepped forward, feeling a shiver run down her spine. As she approached the front door, she noticed something strange, a small, worn plaque attached to the doorframe. She had passed it earlier without noticing it, but now it seemed impossible to ignore. The plaque read, "The Bennett Family." Emily's breath caught. The name felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. She had never heard of the Bennetts before. Yet there was a nagging sensation in the back of her mind, as though the name had been lodged there for years. The dog, still sitting by the door, turned to her and then gave a soft bark. Emily stepped closer and with a trembling hand pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, but as it swung inward, the air inside felt oddly familiar, like stepping into a memory. She couldn't explain it, but everything about this place felt tied to her. Inside, the dust-covered furniture and faded photographs on the walls began to pull at her memories, drawing her deeper into the house, making her wonder just how she had unknowingly become a part of its story. She couldn't explain it, but she knew now that the answers she was searching for were here, waiting for her. Emily stepped carefully into the house, her heart pounding as she looked around. The air inside felt thick with time, as though the walls themselves held on to secrets. The dusty furniture, the faint smell of old wood, and the soft creaks of the floor beneath her feet all seemed to speak of a forgotten history. It was a place suspended in the past, yet Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for her. She wasn't just here to find answers. It felt like she was here to reconnect with something long lost. The dog had followed her inside, his presence steady as ever. He walked up to a table in the corner of the room, where a large wooden chest sat. It was old, worn, with brass hinges that had long since lost their shine. The dog sat down beside it, his eyes locked on Emily as if telling her this was where the journey had led her. With a deep breath, Emily approached the chest. She could feel her pulse in her throat as she crouched down and reached for the latch. The chest creaked open easily, and inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, was a stack of papers, letters, photographs, and what appeared to be a journal. As she carefully unwrapped the cloth, her fingers trembling, she felt a wave of recognition wash over her. These were the same people from the photographs the dog had brought to her. The Bennets. There were pictures of the same woman from before, younger now, standing beside a man Emily didn't recognize. In some of the photos, a small child was with them. And then, in the journal, there were notes. Stories about a family. A love that had once thrived here, and a dog that had been part of it all. The dog that had been lost and then found. The one who had returned, not only for the woman he had loved, but also for the child. The one Emily had been unknowingly tied to all along. Tears filled her eyes as the pieces finally clicked into place. The dog hadn't just been bringing her random objects. He had been trying to reconnect the past with the present, trying to bring a family back together. The items, the photographs, the journal, they were all part of a story, and somehow Emily had been a part of it without even knowing. As she sat back, holding the journal close to her chest, the dog walked up and nudged her hand. She looked down at him, her heart overflowing with gratitude. He had known all along. This was his mission, to find someone who could understand, someone who could carry the memory forward. And now Emily knew that the past, the story of the Bennets, was never truly gone. It lived on in her, in the dog, and in the love that had never faded. With a final glance at the dog, Emily smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. The dog gave a soft bark, and just like that he turned and walked toward the door, as if his purpose had been fulfilled. Emily knew he wouldn't return again, but she also knew that the story he had brought her would stay with her forever. Max's story isn't just a tale about a dog who brought items back to his owner. It's a story about the deep connections we form with those we love. Sometimes love speaks in ways we don't understand, and it's up to us to listen. If this story has touched you, think about the connections you've made in your life. Are you listening to the small gestures, the quiet moments of love? Because sometimes they hold the most important messages.